Greetings to all of you. It gives me great joy to have this opportunity to meet with you again, not in person, but with the magic of technology. I wish to thank Father Aaron and the Resurrection staff for providing this opportunity, and I'd like to thank all of you who sent such kind messages to me after my last presentation. It is truly an honor to thank my family, who is serving as my audience and who will lead the final reflections. Lastly, I wish to give special thanks to my son-in-law, Corey Cross, for his generosity and his technical skill in producing this video. At our October gathering, we reflected on our journey from separation to unity, from us and them to you are that. We reflected on how Jesus challenged the system of exclusivity predominant in his day, and how in his gospel, Mark proclaimed the end of this system when he wrote in metaphor that at Jesus' death, the curtain in the sanctuary was torn in two from top to bottom. We reviewed the wisdom of sages from India, China, the Middle East, and Greece, all of whom asserted our interconnectedness and the centrality of compassion. Finally, pondering the phrase from the Upanishads, "Thou art that," we concluded that the teachings of Indian mystics, axial age wisdom bearers, Jesus, and 20th century sages all proclaimed our interconnectedness. We joined Jan Phillips in deploring the attitude of us and them, agreeing that it must be dispelled and that we all need to participate actively in the divine work of shalom, the creation of unity and peace. Now, 6 months later, we are gathered not only in a time of disunity, but a time of uncertainty, darkness, and fear. We live in a painful now. But I come to you daring to call this now a sacred time, and have entitled this presentation, "The Sacred in the Here and Now." To speak about the sacredness of here and now, I'd like to describe briefly a recent experience which firmly established for me the reality of the sacred in the here and now. On December 21st, we brought my 93-year-old brother-in-law from Mercer Island, Washington, to our home in Grants Pass, Oregon. Joe was in very frail health and needed round-the-clock care. He had no family in Washington, and he chose to come to our home to be with our family rather than staying in his apartment with round-the-clock caregivers. Aided by hospice, we soon established that the space around Joe's hospital bed was sacred space, and the time spent caring for him or just sitting with him became sacred time. I like order. Floors scrubbed, laundry folded, dishes put away, my spices in alphabetical array. But sometimes, while Joe was with us, floors did not get scrubbed or dishes put away, and my orderly array of spices became disordered. All because it became plainly apparent to me that the sacred space in time with Joe was primary. I was left in awe when Joe sometimes saw beyond what I could see, and his arms reached out to someone beyond what I could see. He saw and reached out to someone beyond the veil, and I was present to mystery. The sacredness of now became paramount. I came to realize what an incredible honor it is to be with someone making his final journey. Obviously, the past and the future both hold great importance. We need to learn great lessons from the past and plan judiciously for the future. However, the reality of now has gained far greater significance for me than it once did. My routine, my schedule, do not hold the same importance because insisting on them could easily mean missing the sacred in the now. If someone needs respect, I need to be respectful now, not after the dishes are washed. If someone is in need of compassion, I need to be compassionate now, not after the floor is scrubbed. If someone aches for healing, I need to strive my utmost to be a healer now, not after I'm finished vacuuming. The reality of now has readjusted my focus, and I feel the urgency to bring that new understanding to the task of illuminating the sacredness of now in our present, often painful situation. Our present situation is fraught with uncertainty, anxiety, and fear. The pandemic has blossomed into new variants. When will it be possible for all persons to be vaccinated? When will our kids be able to go back to in-person school full-time? When will political divisiveness become transformed into a workable democracy rather than fueling our uncertainty, our anxiety, our fear? It is like standing on a threshold. Behind us is a place with answers, certainty, control. We had a sense of a regular routine. We could gather with family and friends. We could travel, have face-to-face appointments with medical personnel. But now we are standing on a threshold of uncertainty. Sometimes we might like to return to the space behind us, crawl into bed, pull up the covers, and stay there until things get better. But we are standing on a threshold where there are few answers, where there is worry and anxiety, where we have a lack of control. But wait, this is now. This is a sacred time, and we stand in a sacred place. Paul says in his second letter to the Corinthians, now is the acceptable time. Now is the time of salvation. But Paul, it is a threshold of unknowing and uncertainty, and we don't like it. Sue Monk Kidd, in her book, Where the Heart Waits, dares to ask us, what has happened to our ability to dwell in unknowing? To live inside a question and coexist with the tensions of uncertainty? Richard Rohr adds, I worry about true believers who cannot carry any doubt or anxiety at all. People of great faith often suffer bouts of great doubt. Mother Teresa experienced decades of this kind of doubt. Darkness is such that I really do not see, neither with my mind nor with my reason. It seems that a movement from certitude to doubt, and through doubt to acceptance of life's mystery, is necessary for all encounters, intellectual breakthroughs, and relationships. So we stand on a threshold. Behind us, we had answers, we had certainty, and that felt good. Sue Monk Kidd cautions, the seduction is always security rather than venturing. Instant knowing rather than deliberate waiting. She challenges us, where is our willingness to incubate pain and let it birth something new? What has happened to patient unfolding to endurance. Standing on the threshold of now demands such patient unfolding, such endurance. Lao Tzu describes a wise person this way. The sage is as chaotic as a muddy torrent. Why chaotic as a muddy torrent? Because clarity is learned by being patient in the presence of chaos. Tolerating disarray, remaining at rest, gradually one learns to allow muddy water to settle and proper responses to reveal themselves. Other images for us in this time filled with uncertainty, anxiety, and fear might be a cocoon or a seed buried in the ground. Both the cocoon and the seed hold the promise of new life, of new beginnings, of an emergence. In the darkness of the cocoon, a butterfly is forming, and there is no hurrying the process. It takes waiting in the dark. In the darkness of the earth, a seed holds leaf and flower, but there is no hurrying the process. It takes waiting in the dark. Standing on the threshold of darkness and uncertainty, waiting. The waiting is sacred time. Being in the darkness of the cocoon waiting for wings, the waiting is sacred time. Being a seed buried in the darkness of earth waiting for greening, the waiting is sacred time. Most of the time we are much more into butterflies and flowers than in cocoons and seeds, those sacred vessels where we must wait. Maya Angelou says in Rainbow in the Cloud, "We delight in the beauty of the butterfly, but rarely admit the changes it has gone through to achieve that beauty." Can we wait for the patient unfolding? What we do while standing on our current threshold of uncertainty is critical. What we do in the darkness of the cocoon or as a seed buried in the darkness of the earth is vitally important. This is threshold time, cocoon time, seed time, waiting time, sacred time. We will emerge from this sacred time either having grown or having shriveled. One can find a number of self-help materials concerning living in the here and now. Eckhart Tolle has an acclaimed source in his The Power of Now. However, I would like to reflect on several figures from Scripture to make this sacred now time more meaningful. Some of these figures may be unfamiliar to you, but their stories yield abundant meaning to gain understanding for the pattern of transformation or lack of it. I will contrast how Jonah and Job and his friends emerged from their thresholds of unknowing, and I will reflect on a group of women who stood in their cocoon of barrenness, suffering scorn and disdain, and emerging from that darkness to a celebration of birth. Lastly, we will reflect on Jesus as he stood on two important thresholds in his life: the temptation before he began his public ministry, and the Garden of Gethsemane before his passion and death. First, we will consider the person of Jonah. We may all be familiar with the story of Jonah, but unfortunately, we likely never understood it as a parable. Just as Jesus used parables such as the Good Samaritan, the sower and the seed, and the great feast to teach lessons, the parable of Jonah, with its 4 great wonders and its metaphors, stands in Scripture as a teaching tool. Because Jonah is listed among the prophets, we may think that he stood in the company of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, who took their call seriously and tried their utmost to bring to their people what they understood to be God's message. But Jonah was like none of these prophets. In fact, he was a caricature of a prophet, deliberately presented in that light by the author of the parable. The story is not historical. It is a parable meant to teach. The story came out of the time after the exile. The main attitude of the Israelites at the time was that anyone they considered an enemy should be destroyed, smited. Thinking in us and them terms was the norm. The Israelites, now back home after their exile in Babylon, displayed some very narrow-minded views. Having suffered from wars and exile, Israelites viewed all non-Israelites as enemies, them, who should be hated, shunned, and hopefully destroyed. A major prophet of this period, 2nd Isaiah, sees beyond this narrow-mindedness. He calls Israel to a new role, to be the servant of the nations. In the second servant song, this prophet proclaims, "It is too little for you, Israel, to be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob and restore the survivors of Israel. I will make you a light to the nations, that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth." Unfortunately, Israel was not ready to take on this role of servant or to be a light to the nations. These nations, them, were enemies. The legendary city of Nineveh represented all that was hateful, repugnant, and cruel to Israel. Nineveh was them in relation, in contrast to Israel's us. God, showing compassion to such people, presented a serious challenge to Israel's exclusivism. Jonah reflects this narrow-mindedness in his attitude toward the Ninevites. The parable of Jonah is a protest, fueled by Isaiah's servant songs against Israel's narrow-mindedness and exclusivity. True prophets answered the call they heard, even though it was hard and they felt inadequate. Jonah simply did not want to be a prophet. In no way was he going to preach to the hated Ninevites. He was convinced it would not do any good because the Ninevites were so depraved they would never change. Speaking of God's mercy to such a people, them, was out of the question for Jonah. So he ran away and boarded a ship headed for Tarshish in the opposite direction from Nineveh. The parable of Jonah is an incredible story, an unforgettable story with its 4 great wonders: the great storm, the great fish, the great conversion, and the great gourd plant. Besides being unforgettable literary elements in the parable, each of these wonders also depicts a now time, either for Jonah or the Ninevites. The first wonder is the huge, unexpected storm. Jonah was convinced the storm was his fault because he had refused God's call, and so he told the sailors to throw him overboard. This becomes a threshold for the sailors. In this now time, they went from fear of the great storm to fear about throwing Jonah overboard and offending his God, to awe in the face of the immediate cessation of the storm when they threw Jonah overboard. Jonah's God was true and worthy of their worship. Their immediate conversion stands in strong contrast to Jonah's refusal to respond to God's call to speak to the Ninevites. There is irony in the fact that Jonah's flight from God meant he unwittingly served God as the one through whom pagan sailors came to know and worship Yahweh. Now we come to the second great wonder in the story, the great fish that appeared and saved Jonah by swallowing him. Alive in the belly of the great fish, Jonah had a 3-day threshold to reflect on his situation. Will this be a now time, a sacred time and place, a time of growth and understanding? The author tells of no such conversion for Jonah. The prophet is glad to be alive and sings a psalm of praise to God for saving him from the depths of the sea. However, there is no indication of a change of attitude toward them, the Ninevites. After 3 days, the great fish spit Jonah out on the shore, and Jonah emerged unchanged from his now time. The word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time, thinking he was not going to get out of it this time. Jonah went to Nineveh. His brief message, only 5 words in Hebrew, 40 days more and Nineveh shall be destroyed, brings us to the third great wonder in the story, the now time for the Ninevites. Hearing Jonah's terse message, they responded with an immediate conversion. The king proclaimed a fast for everyone, including all the cattle and the sheep. And he ordered all, even the animals, to be clothed in sackcloth. All of Nineveh proclaimed their belief in the God Jonah had said would destroy them, the God who did not carry out the threat Jonah had announced. Jonah was really peeved, and he begged to die because God showed mercy to the wicked Ninevites. He built himself a hut where he could watch what would happen to the city. A fourth great wonder appears in the story. God provided a broad-leafed gourd plant to provide shade for Jonah. But a worm attacked the plant, and a hot desert wind withered it. Here is another threshold, another now moment for Jonah. Could he see a relationship between the withered plant and himself? Jonah moaned that he'd be better off dead. God asked Jonah, "Have you reason to be angry over the plant?" Jonah answered, "I'm angry enough to die." Like a spoiled child, he persisted in thinking God is unfair. God gives mercy to the Ninevites but can't provide shade for me. God has no business being kind to them and neglecting us. There is nothing admirable about Jonah, who is narrow-minded, petulant, and selfish. Let's look for a moment at his now, his metaphorical threshold, his cocoon, the belly of the great fish. Dark, uncertain. Jonah was grateful to God for saving him from the depths of the sea, but standing on this threshold, in his now, Jonah does not see its sacredness. In the darkness, as in a cocoon or seed, Jonah had a chance to change and grow. He emerged from the belly of the great fish, the threshold of opportunity for him, but he was unchanged. Here we see another example of irony. Jonah was convinced the Ninevites would never change, but they did. It was he, however, who remained firmly unchanged. He went to Nineveh and preached a short message of destruction because he knew he would not get away with running away again. The belly of the great fish had provided Jonah with a metaphorical threshold, a cocoon, to make a change, but he refused to see the sacred in the here and now. He remained closed to the possibility of change, of seeing non-Israelites as possible partners rather than enemies. The story of Jonah illustrates one way of emerging from a threshold, unchanged, a way of emerging from a cocoon, shriveled. The withered gourd plant at the end of the story stands as an undeniable metaphor for Jonah.